Bitcoin is the first and really only credible way to break out of that. So while I'm never 100% sure on any asset, there's all sorts of challenges and frictions that can happen. But if it's not Bitcoin, I don't really know what else it would be. So I think that's how I'd phrase that.
Hey guys, welcome back to Everyday Finance. In this video, Lyn Alden discuss about Bitcoin. Lyn Alden says, one of those things is Bitcoin. It's complicated enough that despite how much time you've spent researching it, you're still learning about it. However, the more I understand it, the more optimistic I am, and at the same time, the more I kind of view it being the only practical way to alter certain of our financial elements. One of the book's major topics is a type of technical determinism, or the idea that things sort of had to happen this way, related to the sort of or similar to the order of technologies that evolved, and that, at least for this time period, nevertheless, we seem to be locked in this regional money maximum where transaction speeds are quite slow. We've got a century and a half, yet settlement speeds of anything rare like gold have been exceedingly slow. Half of required abstraction, which is simple to centralize and govern. Utilizing leverage in Bitcoin is the first, and in all honesty, the only reliable means to escape, therefore, even though I can never be completely certain about any asset, because there are obstacles of all kinds, frictions that may arise, but if it's not Bitcoin, I'm not sure what would be. So I believe that's how it was phrased, and lots of things Lyn Alden discuss, so please watch the video to end, and share. Subscribe our channel, Everyday Finance, thanks.
The more I learn about it, and Bitcoin's one of those things, it's complex enough that no matter how long you've researched it, you always are still learning about it. But the more I learn about it, the more bullish I get. And at the same time, I kind of view it as the only realistic method to change some of our monetary aspects. So one of the big themes in the book is kind of like technological determinism, which is that things kind of had to turn out this way, at least for this time period, just due to the order of technologies that emerged and that naturally would emerge. But we're kind of stuck in this local maximum of money, where transaction speeds are very fast, but settlement speeds of anything scarce like gold have been very slow. And so we've kind of had a century and a half of necessary abstraction, and that's easy to centralize and control and leverage. And Bitcoin is the first and really only credible way to break out of that. So while I'm never 100% sure on any asset, there's all sorts of challenges and frictions that can happen. But if it's not Bitcoin, I don't really know what else it would be. So I think that's how I'd phrase it. Yeah, I mean, there are technologies, and sometimes there are things that we think of as basic today, like running water, for example, or refrigeration, where you just have to show people it exists and then they want it, right? You don't have to convince them, you don't have to force them to get it. It's just engineers can sometimes make something so good that it permanently solves a problem almost for everyone over time as it becomes more and more accessible. And that's something that politicians can't really do, and any sort of ideas and things like that, or governance structures and things like that, they're inherently these temporary local phenomenon, right? So some countries, if they're governed well, are going to do better than other countries for that epoch, that period of time. But technology can just change things globally, and then that change is permanent. We have refrigeration, and more people have access to it, almost everybody now. And that's just a permanent part of the human experience now. And I kind of view the same thing as money, applying to money, which is that when certain things happened, it changed how we interact with money, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, because you can actually, in some ways, have a technology that has consequences to it. And so it's one of those things where I think a lot of the criticisms of central banks and monetary kind of governance in general, while I agree with a lot of them, when we look around and we see that it's happening literally everywhere, that's not a coincidence. That's basically it's been a technological limitation that moved incentives in that direction. So the way I describe it in the book, there's 160 different fiat currencies. Some of them are pegged to the dollar, but a lot of pegs can break, and a lot of the other ones are free floating. And so you have all these little currency bubbles, and you ask, why is it like this? Why isn't, out of 200 countries, why isn't one on a gold standard? Or why isn't one kind of doing free banking, right? The fact that every single country, pretty much, at least any country of scale that's not just like, say, using the dollar or something, but every country of scale does things this general way. And I think that's basically there's been a technological reason for that. And unless or until you have wide usability of fast settlement, which is with Bitcoin being the first credible way to do that, and so far the most liquid, most decentralized, most immutable way of doing that, then that problem doesn't really solve it. So I think instead of just complaining about the Fed or complaining about the system and kind of like waiting for it to blow up and then trying to protect yourself, I think this is like the era where if Bitcoin's going to succeed, it's got to be built, and people have to go out and build that parallel system. And if you're successful, and it's like refrigeration, where you don't have to convince people to want refrigeration, it's just obvious. Bitcoin just has to be better than the alternatives, and that's what makes it win. Sure. So I view basically that, once the telegraph was invented, that allowed for rapid transmission of data. But transactions require a lot less data than settlements. So it's easy to, with something as simple as Morse code, you can do a transaction with someone. Whereas, digital settlement or fast global settlement requires something like Bitcoin, which, if you look at what Bitcoin requires, it requires much more complex math, much more complex processors, much more complex telecommunication systems. I mean, the internet, which didn't exist back then, but then not even just the internet, you need relatively high bandwidth ways of transmitting data to have the kind of the throughput we have today with Bitcoin. And then you need certain encryption methods that, the latest encryption method that Bitcoin uses wasn't invented or released until like 2001, right? So it's kind of like Bitcoin came almost as quickly as it could have, based on the bandwidth, the processing, the encryption methods that all kind of came together. So I would argue that it's inevitable that something like the telegraph would come way before Bitcoin. And because that happened, that creates this window, which in our case was a century and a half. Maybe if there's alien races, maybe they had a shorter window, maybe they have a longer window, but that window is going to exist. And in that window, it greatly amplifies the power of those that run money, right? Because now you necessitate abstraction. If you can transfer value, if you can make transactions very quickly, but you can't settle gold very quickly, then those who are keeping the ledgers and running things are basically have a monopoly status now. And a government, has trouble enforcing rules on all of its individuals, but it can easily enforce rules on a handful of banks. Basically, it's 1,000-fold less entities to go after. You can say all banks have to do this rule, and so governments were able to centralize their banking systems and basically have a monopoly. And that's how we end up in this world of 160 different fiat currencies, which are all these little bubbles. And then outside of the top 10 currencies or so, currencies not really accepted anywhere else. So for example, Thai baht, Egyptian pounds, even currencies of wealthy countries like Norway. If I go around in New Jersey trying to spend Norway physical currency, it's actually going to be quite challenging to get that off my hands. The saleability is extremely low outside of its own country and maybe a couple neighboring countries. And so we've been in this environment where technology, the order that it had to happen in, and for quite a while, has put us in this kind of local maximum. And the invention of Bitcoin is the first credible way to end that era. We've now, after another century and a half from the telegraph, we now have digital settlement. So we have a ledger that is decentralized rather than centralized, and you can send bearer asset final settlement around. So it's not based on debt, it's not based on credit, it's not based on an IOU. It's actually just finally settled through the software logic and control. And that is, it was inevitable that Bitcoin would happen. Now the question is it inevitable that Bitcoin wins, right? I can picture a world where, say, the person who figured out Bitcoin was like a scammer, right? Imagine if someone was as smart as Satoshi, but they gave themselves a pre-mine or something, right? Or spent their coins, or just had a terrible personality, never disappeared, and revealed who they were. And I can imagine a world where the second currency instead kind of overtakes the first one, right? If the first one was kind of launched poorly. But I think in some way this is now a technology that exists. We're fortunate that Bitcoin was the first one rather than kind of a scammy one being first. That allowed the network effect to accumulate on a good system without having to be disrupted, hopefully. And so we had this is like the first real shot to get out of the century and a half window we've been in. And so I think it's important to keep analyzing risks, things that could prevent that. And I think it's important for people to do what they can to support that system. I think it's important for companies to build on it. I think it's important for people to, talk about it. They can let their politicians know that they're in favor of it. There's all sorts of little things that people can do around the margins that give Bitcoin the breathing room it needs to get out of its child state and into, the more large and liquid and secure it gets, the better shot it has that this is actually going to continue taking off. And so that's one thing I approach differently than other people. Is a lot of people approach like a moral argument against central banking, whereas I say the fact that it exists everywhere is something more than just morals. It's some sort of technology, some sort of conditions that allow that to basically uniformly emerge everywhere. And so the question is, what state of affairs would disincentivize that behavior? What would make that no longer the best model of doing things? And I would argue that something like Bitcoin is really the only visible thing I see on the horizon that has a shot of disrupting that century and a half. I mean, I think it's one of those things that it's a good discussion to have. I think the fact that Bitcoin is hard to change by design is a good thing. And so even some things that are maybe improvements to Bitcoin, most things are trade-offs. Like they make one variable better, they make one variable worse. Other ones could be strict improvements, like we get better encryption methods, we get more sophisticated software techniques. There are direct improvements that can be done, but it's a good thing that those are hard to add to the network. And basically, miners and nodes both have varying degrees of power in terms of forcing those types of changes. I think it is a long-term risk that not everyone, like the Bitcoin's throughput is limited. But I don't think it's the same thing that happened with gold. So the problem with gold is that gold itself was so slow that you had to abstract it to keep up in the telecommunications age. So even in 1875, which was, the telegraph had only been around for a few decades in Europe, and the first cross-Atlantic one was only put in place in the late 1860s. And so this was like a decade after, kind of the whole Western world was connected with telegraph. And you already had a situation where there were like 20 claims for gold for every ounce of gold in the system. And basically the author of that book in 1875, Jevons, was both excitedly explaining how efficient the system has become, that you barely ever need to use gold anymore, but he's also warning that this, the fact that this leverage because of that is very dangerous. And so we have to never forget that all these claims are redeemable for gold should that happen. With Bitcoin, I don't really see that type of risk manifesting, that you need to fully abstract it. But instead, I think it is going to be the case that either there's going to be a lot of custodial environments for Bitcoin, or there's going to be federations and things like that. I think people underestimate the tool set that we have available in Bitcoin that is a noticeable improvement compared to what we had before. Because, for example, you can have a custodian that is federated and that the key signers are in multiple different countries, for example. That's something you can't do with a gold custodian. You can also have, with Chalmian mints, which is like 40-year-old technology that never really found a home until Bitcoin potentially kind of revives it. That allows a custodian to custody someone's funds without even knowing the details of who they're custodying for, what they're paying, how much they have, things like that. So you can get private custodianship, which is hard or impossible in most other types of physical systems. So I do think that there are, even with Bitcoin's constrained base layer, there still are a lot of improvements kind of that are possible in these higher layers. And then I don't think we should rule out the potential for soft forks like covenants or things like that that can improve access to the base layer without kind of risking decentralization that you would get if you were in favor of, say, block size increases, right? We've already kind of gone down that route. I do think that there are covenants or, potentially zero knowledge proofs or something. We'll see what happens. I don't think there's a rush for it because there's only so much demand for base layer block space to begin with.
Right.
But as say if we have an environment where Bitcoin's kind of persistently used by 10x more people, and high fees become a more persistent thing, that could change incentives a little bit towards a fork that maybe finds an efficiency to strictly improve it, rather than improve it in one way but hurt the decentralization in another way. So I'm still generally optimistic, but even if Bitcoin just stays the way it is, I think people are sometimes too negative on custody, because you still can have custody that is more decentralized or more secure than you have, and quicker, and kind of backed up by software, rather than purely credit.